What's up everyone, welcome back to the channel and to another 3D model. This week, we are going to be doing things a little bit differently. We are going to make a space station corridor. Now, we have a lot of things to get through and not a lot of time, so let's just dive into it. So when it came to this space station corridor, I wanted to make this video more towards video games. So there's a few things I wanted to keep in mind while creating this little environment. One of the first things I wanted to do was make these pieces modular. That way we can pretend it's part of a larger scene or a larger game, and we can reuse some of these assets if we wanted to add on to it. The second important thing to keep in mind was poly count. Poly counts are very important, of course, and performance is always one of the most important things when you're creating a video game and you're working in video game engines. So we're gonna really try to be aware of our poly count and not make anything too detailed. Of course, we can add those details into our high poly mesh and we can bake those onto our lower poly mesh. So for this video, we're gonna create two meshes so we can have a lower poly asset for in-game. Another really important thing, and you can argue what's even more important than polys, are the texture sizes and texture amounts. And to be honest with you, with a scene like this, I probably should have used trim sheets or tileable textures. Now looking back, I probably would have done that, but I just ended up using texture sets. I basically just created a different texture for each modular piece that I had, but looking back now, I probably should have just used one trim sheet. That way I can just reuse a lot of those same textures or materials on all of those assets, with just using basically one material. And then for all the other important details, like all the labels and things like that, I just could have used decals. And to be honest with you, we could have cut back those materials even more. But we are gonna aim for just a 2K texture set. That way we can make it a little bit more realistic for a video game environment. Now there's one very important thing I wanted to talk about, and that was time. So originally I create these videos over 2 days, and I had a bunch of stuff come up on my second day, and I unfortunately had to pivot last minute to change my approach. So what I mean is, you'll see throughout this video, I actually created a kind of a little wall piece I was planning to make mechanically functional. That way the door could open and we could have a little cubby in the wall so we can animate that door to go up and down as if it's part of a video game. So you'll see throughout the modeling process, I spend a little bit of time creating these doors and spending time just trying to figure out how they're gonna work. But in the end, I actually don't use them at all. And like I said, I just simply ran out of time. I really had to get this video done in 1 day. So we kind of have to speed things up a little bit and cut some corners wherever we can. I spent around, I think, 7 hours in total for everything. So that really doesn't leave us a lot of time to model UV and texture. And at the very end, I did want to throw this thing in Unreal Engine, which we will do as well. And if you want to see the full process, you can find it all on my Patreon page. We'll go more into detail about that later on in the video, but it's just something important I wanted to make note of. Another unfortunate thing is I had an incredible amount of crashes for some reason. My computer never crashes. Maya always works very well on my computer. And honestly, I think it crashed like 6 or 7 times throughout this whole video. So if you see some points in the video kind of jump and it looks like it's not seamless, that's simply why. Just because it crashed, I had to stop recording and I had to jump back into it to carry on wherever I left off. So there are a few things that if you notice some little parts are missing, that's simply why. It was a really interesting weekend. Everything was going against me and I feel like my computer wasn't cooperating well. So it's just something else I wanted to make a note of ahead of time. This video doesn't seem as seamless as usual, and that's just simply why. Alright, so of course the most important part at the beginning is blocking things out. So what I decided to do was start with some of the main shapes. Of course, we're trying to make a modular piece, so what I'm going to do is focus on just one wall and kind of split this up into 3 or 4 different sections. I wanted the floor to be one piece that I can basically tile around if I wanted to, as well as the walls. So we're going to break this thing up into 3 different parts. One's going to be one wall that's going to have that door piece I was talking about that I was originally planning to add into it. We're going to add a middle piece, and then we're just going to duplicate that same wall with the door for our third wall as well. And I'm going to treat this as kind of 3 different modular pieces that I can just, once again, just duplicate and slide over if I wanted to recreate more wall sections. Of course, you can add more if you have more time, but that was my goal when I was starting out, was to make 3 main wall pieces. Now, when it comes to reference, of course, this is going to be aimed a little bit towards the sci-fi kind of universe. So I had 2 games in mind. One was Warframe from Digital Extremes, and the other one was Argo from Star Citizen. Those are 2 really fun games, and those were the 2 inspirations I was drawing from when I wanted to create this whole environment. So I used Google Images as my main source of reference, and I just found random images online to kind of take inspiration from. That being said, we are gonna more or less just figure it out as we go. We're gonna experiment along the way. You're gonna see me try some things and then just completely remove them. So we're gonna just see what works and what doesn't as we go. Now, when it comes to the modeling, I was planning to spend no more than 3 hours tops on the low poly. I wanted to quickly get this thing done. Like I said, I was originally planning to do the texturing and the whole Unreal part in the second day on Sunday. But since I had some family plans come up, I really had to just pivot halfway. And like I said, we just changed things up. So we had to kind of speed, put our head down, get to work, and try to get as much done as we can in a short amount of time. So when it comes to some of these components, obviously we just simplified them, but if you have more time, I would recommend spending a bit more time making it more mechanically interesting to look at, and you can definitely add a lot more details in certain areas. And that's another big thing when it comes to the high poly mesh. Originally, I was planning on adding a lot of those elements like booleans and different bolts and stuff into the high poly mesh. That way we can bake that information over into our normal map and use that lower poly mesh in game. But I honestly had almost no time to create the high poly mesh, so all I did was really bevel out some edges to create some nice smooth curvature, and then we can just simply use that to bake out the curvature information into our low poly mesh. So I really wish I could have spent more time adding more details and doing a little bit more with this model, but like I said, time was really working against me this weekend, so we just had to work with the time that we had. So enough of me talking, we need to start blocking out some of these main shapes and start piecing together this corridor. Now don't forget, you can find this full video on my Patreon page, which I will add in the description below, and that will also include the full UV mapping process. And what I decided to do for this week's video is add some narration into the Unreal element. I know I don't do a lot of Unreal work on this channel, but I thought it'd be helpful and educational to add that for my Patreon. So if that's something you're interested in, please go check it out. It's on my Patreon page, and it's also the best way you can help support my work. So please go check that out. I will link it in the description below. All right, enough of me talking. Let's continue blocking out these main shapes, and let's slowly build our space station corridor. right, so before we jump into those UVs, I just quickly want to give a shout out to this week's video sponsor, PCBWay. PCBWay offers a variety of services ranging from PCB production, sheet metal fabrication, injection molding, 3D printing, and much more. You can quickly upload your own files and get a quote immediately. So if you're building something at home or want to print one of your own 3D models, PCBWay makes it extremely easy to get custom parts for your projects, even if you don't have the necessary tools. They take care of everything so you can get those parts shipped directly to your front door. Another really great feature is their 24-hour production status transparency. Whenever you order something, it's really helpful to actually know how everything is going and to keep track of where everything is. And with PCBWay, they offer a 24-hour production status transparency window where all customers can check their production status about their own orders. So if you're working on a project or need 3D printing or any of these other services, make sure to check them out in the description below. And once again, thank you PCBWay for sponsoring this week's video. All right, so here is the space station corridor in its finished form. Now, like I said, I went ahead and combined some of these objects together into those different pieces that we were talking about. So if I drop down my folder here in my outliner, you can see I have one for the door. So this is all one object. That way I can just simply drop this in. I knew I didn't want to have any of these pieces separate. Of course, maybe separating this frame would have been handy so we can reuse it as one of those modular pieces, but I wanted to keep this as one piece. And then the door as well. So this is just mirrored over. So I just had one door I had to work with. That way we can animate it if you wanted to opening and closing. And that's basically the very first group. The second was the floor piece. So this was set up into two different pieces. I have one for the one side and one for the other. Now I just textured one, as you can see in the UV map, which we will go over soon. They're both sharing the same UV map. I was planning just to use one piece so that way you can more or less just reuse this over and over again. So the floor I just separated into its own group. And then the walls. So like I said, originally I wanted the 3 different wall pieces. So I have this front piece as one piece, the middle piece, and the third on the side. Now, like I said, there are these boxes on the back. I was planning on making these mechanically open. So actually I can show you what I was planning to do. If I duplicate one of these over, let's just separate it. So originally I was planning on making this one group. So let's just combine. So basically the wall would work like this. You would have one piece that moves up, and then this piece would be the second one, and then this third one would just go down. I thought it'd be cool. It obviously would have been fun to do. I just had no time to do that. Like I said, I spent so much time making these doors work or look like they would work, and I ended up not doing it. So that's something I wanted to mention because it would have been fun to do. And if you're gonna recreate this mesh, I would recommend doing this. Oh, these 2 pieces as well would be part of this group. So that would go down, but you kind of get the idea. So I decided to cut that out because I had no time. So I just basically merged it together. So this whole back piece is irrelevant at this point. You could just delete it to save UV space, but it is what it is. I decided to still keep it in the model. Maybe something we can come back to, or all my patrons will have access to this model. So go ahead and separate it and kind of create your own. That'd be kind of fun. And then, like I said, these ones, same thing with this door. And I decided to split this second piece off since I was going to mirror it in Unreal Engine to create the other wall. But this is also just one piece that you can kind of create for other modular wall pieces. It'd be also fun. What I would recommend doing is maybe creating one more piece that was longer, something like this. That way you can use this as a filler for different walls. So you can kind of grab this one and you can kind of add them together. And you can add another wall piece down here. So you kind of get the idea. You can kind of create a whole hallway if you really wanted to. So let's go over these UVs really quickly. Open up my UV editor. The first door, as you can see, all of the pink or red pieces are just mirrored over. So these are sharing the same UV space. It's pretty straightforward. I'm not gonna lie to you, I could have done a better job on the UV map and really take advantage. I always tell people, if you're familiar with this channel, to prioritize that UV space, and looking at this, just It bothers me. There's lots of wasted space. I could really enlarge some of these shells to get more resolution out of those materials. But I was honestly full tilt rushing the UV process. I honestly, if you follow along, I use the automatic UV for a lot of these basic shapes, which I really never use. I like the 3D Cut and Sew UV tool. I find it works better in a lot of cases than the automatic UV, but I was really rushing it. So like I said, just really quickly put this one together. The floor as well, it's its own group and its own material. Once again, could have done better here, not gonna lie, but it is what it is. It is important to obviously keep those shells fairly straight. This one is not even fully straight. I feel like you could have turned it a tiny bit more, but it is what it is. Anyways, these two pieces are sharing the same space, which is going to help me also texture. And then the other piece were the walls. So I broke this up obviously into 3 different groups for the 3 different wall pieces. So the first one is like this. The second one is like this, just duplicating, sharing the same UV space. I mirrored over a lot of these pieces that are red just from this side over. And as well this last piece here. And then that last wall piece is part of my top piece, I believe, or is this part of, it's part of one of these pieces, I forget where. It's part of this piece right here, my first wall. So I just slid that into this texture because I didn't want to create another texture for this tiny piece. It wouldn't really make sense. So once again, these are sharing the same UV space. So that's how I broke my space station up. Kind of wanted it to be something that you can kind of reuse more towards video games. Like I said, kept poly counts fairly low. So as you can see, majority of these pieces don't have beveled edges. Just these handles I beveled basically in this piece up here, but everything else is just hard edged. And then for the high poly mesh, I just duplicated that over and just beveled edges. So this door just has beveled edges. All these pieces are just nicely beveled. And same with the floor piece. That way I can get a bit more curvature, and when we bake out that information from our high and low in Substance, hopefully we can carry over some of that curvature to make it look a bit more smooth. Now, this is one area that I would probably add more details. You can add more booleans to add more details into these panels. I was planning to add some square booleans into these, which I ended up adding in Substance Painter into the materials. But once again, you can get away with baking a lot of that high poly detail over to your low poly. So I wasn't even going to create this last minute, and since I said and I was planning to do it, since it's part of a whole video game process of creating high and low poly model workflow, I didn't want to just completely cut that out of the video. So I still made a high poly, but like I said, all I did was just bevel edges. So now that we have our high and our low ready to go, all I have to do is assign a material to these different pieces, and then we can export this and jump over to Substance Painter and we can start our texturing. And don't forget, if you want to see the full UV mapping process, you can find it all on my Patreon page on that real-time video. All right, let's export this thing. Let's jump over to Substance and start the texturing. All right, so now jumping over to Substance Painter, we're gonna load in that high and low poly mesh and we can bake out those textures. Now, once again, like I said at the beginning of the video, when it came to the whole texturing and inspiration, I found a lot of different images from Argo, the video game, as well as Warframe. So I just took random elements and colors that I found interesting. I really like the whole color pattern of like the orange and the metal kind of dark tones. So I kind of thought we would approach it in that way. They were both relevant in both those games, and I thought it would just be kind of fun and sci-fi looking. As well as all those metal pieces, I wanted to look like metal, like some sort of space station corridor, something that's, you know, needs to be sturdy and mechanically inclined, but also, you know, a sci-fi look to it. I didn't want it looking completely realistic, but also it's kind of like blending a whole sci-fi theme with realism, I guess you could say. But that's kind of the approach I was going for. Now, I did have access to this image here, which shows a bunch of different pieces, and this is actually from the game Argo. So I decided to use these as a lot of those alphas that I can stamp on for just details like different labels and different patterns. That way I can just make it look just a bit more interesting. Now, since I didn't have a complete direction I was working towards, we are going to experiment a little bit along the way. So I'm just going to use a lot of those built-in smart materials as some sort of base. That way it can help me figure out what materials I kind of want to work with, and then I can kind of build off of them or just recreate them. But I like using those built-in materials to kind of figure out what I want where and just experiment with different metals. It just kind of helps me figure out, kind of brainstorm and test different things to see what works and what doesn't. Now, of course, this is one area. Looking back, I feel like I should have spent a bit more time on the texturing process. Obviously, in a perfect world, you could spend a week or two making a model like this and really make it optimized and make it look just better. The textures, you can spend a lot of time just trying different things and experimenting. But I really didn't have a lot of time. I had like maybe 2 hours tops I could invest into the texturing process. So it really didn't leave me a lot of time to experiment. So we kind of have to go with whatever we choose and just kind of make it work. Now, I did come back at the very end and just tweak some things, especially after throwing it in Unreal Engine, seeing how it was lit up and seeing some of those reflections and the roughness values. I'll just jump back into Substance and just tweak things a little bit and then re-import those textures. So I did spend a little bit of time at the end, but like I said, I really didn't have a lot of time this week. So we're gonna rush this one a bit and try to just get things done fairly quickly. Now, one other thing, I did use 1 or 2 materials from the Substance source website. So the tiling pattern on the floor, that was one material, I'll post it up here, that I found on the Substance source website. So if you're paying for Substance, you should have free access to all of these different materials. But don't worry, you don't have to use this one. There's lots of different materials you can use directly in Substance. You can just create them. For example, that floor pattern, if you want to recreate that look and you don't have access to the Substance source website, I would just use a simple fill layer, bring that metallic up to create some sort of just base metal looking texture that you can use on the floor. And then in the alphas, or in the textures, at the very bottom, there's a striped pattern, and you can just add that as a height map into that channel, or into just add another fill layer with only the height channel being clicked on. And then you can add that same tile pattern on the floor. The reason why I just reused that material was because it just made the process a little bit quicker for myself. So a lot of those materials you can download, you can recreate yourself if you can just invest more time in recreating them. But like I said, we were very limited on time, so I just went with one that I thought looked interesting and we just applied it to the floor. And the floor is maybe one area out of everything I'd probably spend a bit more time on. I spent almost 0 time on the ceiling. I knew that wouldn't really be too much in view. I just clicked on the random metal on those piping objects and just kind of went with it. But the floor and the ceiling are 2 areas that I feel like we could have done or experimented with a little bit more. I feel like it would have been nice to have some sort of vent object or some sort of vent pattern on the side on the floor between all those little panel pieces. And then in Unreal, maybe having like some smoke coming out, that'd be really cool. But also the ceiling, it's just very plain. I made sure not to draw your eyes to it too much because there was almost no detail up there, but I feel like we could have added something cool to those piping pieces, maybe some labels on some of the pipings, like different words and numbers. And that's just one area that I really avoided. And now looking back, that's something I feel like I wish I could spend a bit more time improving. Now, don't get me wrong, there's always room for improvement. A model is really never finished. As Da Vinci once said, one of my favorite quotes is, "Art is never finished, it's abandoned." And I feel like experienced artists, you just get better at figuring out when to abandon your artwork. And this is definitely something I had to let go pretty early, but you can really work on a model or a piece endlessly over months, years even, and slowly refine them in a perfect world. But obviously that's not realistic for a video game. So if you're going to recreate your assets and you're practicing, I recommend just putting a time limit on it. That's how it works in the real world. When you're working with a game studio or you're working on any project, there usually is a time limit. So I would recommend sticking to that, and it just makes you work a little bit better and a little bit quicker. And the more you work in a time limit or in a time frame, you just get better at kind of working in that fast-paced environment. So if you're a new artist and you're trying to get in the industry, that's something I would recommend doing. I feel like it's going to really help you improve in those little areas, especially when it comes to thinking quickly on your feet. All right, enough of me rambling on. We got to start texturing this asset. So let's start filling in these empty meshes with materials. We can slowly texture our space station corridor. Don't forget, you can find it all in real time on my Patreon page. And that is everything. That is the full 3D modeling, UV mapping, and texturing process that I did to create this space station corridor. I really hope you guys enjoyed this week's video, and if you did, hit that like button and please consider subscribing to the channel. And don't forget, you can find this full video in real time, which also includes a full UV mapping process and also a fully narrated part showing how I imported the model into Unreal Engine and how I just connected all those textures. You can find that full video on my Patreon page, which I will link in the description below. And also a massive thank you to all my patrons. I really can't thank you all enough for your continuous support, so thank you so much for supporting my art. All right, I hope you guys enjoyed this week's video, and I will catch you all in the next one.